Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book to show comparison for the Expanse Season 2, Episode 10, Cascade. This video is part of a series of videos where I compare the Expanse TV show to that of its source material, pointing out the differences and giving my opinions on how well I think these adaptations work. I am by no means an expert on the novels, but I have read them recently for a second time and thought it would be fun to compare the two. Also, I have to give a spoiler warning up to the end of Season 2. If you haven't seen all of Season 2, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. However, I will not spoil events from the books that have yet to occur in the show beyond Season 2. So, our episode begins on Ganymede, where Holden, Naomi, and Amos takes Prax to a wall that lists the missing and the dead to find either May or Dr. Strickland and see if they're on that list, which gives them some hope, but because they are not on that list. So they decide to search Dr. Strickland's last known location, the Pediatric Care Center, for other survivors who may have information on what happened to May. So as I mentioned in the previous videos, Prax never left Ganymede in the novel, so he had already talked to a daycare worker, which was May's last location before Prax met up with Holden. Also, Holden at this stage in the novels is still unaware of Dr. Strickland's involvement, so isn't looking for him. But either way is fine for its respective medium, so I'll give this a 0. So then we go back to Earth, where Aaron Wright, Avasarala, and Wynn are on their way to a meeting with the Martian delegation, and Wynn expresses his disbelief in Draper's story about a seventh man without a vac suit that was attacking the UN soldiers, dismissing her as crazy. But Avasarala is more inclined to believe her and states that Draper doesn't seem crazy to her, and Aaron Wright actually sides with Avasarala, agreeing it's obvious that Draper didn't agree with the story that the Martians were presenting, indicating that they're lying. When they meet with the Martian delegation, Avasarala brings up the topic of Bobby Draper, but the Martians say that she's under stress and is receiving treatment. When Avasarala presses the matter further, the Martians deflect, saying that they need to get back to the important peace talks at hand. So, in the novels, as I mentioned earlier, the peace talks were much different and more boring and just bureaucratic nonsense. And Admiral Wynn wasn't there, as he was already on the front lines around Ganymede. And the UN delegation was already aware of the existence of the protomolecule hybrid, as they had footage of their own. So what's interesting here when comparing the show to the novels is the subtext, which is totally different. Because in the show, the subtext is Aaron Wright doesn't know what's going on any more than Avasarala does, as he was cut off from Jules Pierre Mal, and he's now starting to suspect that Mal took his protomolecule technology to the Martians, and that's what they're hiding, and he, of course, is correct. And that's what motivates him to find out more about it. Whereas in the novels, Aaron Wright is full aware of what went on Ganymede, as unlike the show when the Martians are working exclusively with Mal, the Ganymede Incident was just their test run. In the novels, the Ganymede Incident was an exhibition to open the bidding for the protomolecule technology. So at this stage in the novels, Aaron Wright is currently in a bidding war against the Martians for this technology. But either way is fine, but I do like how Aaron Wright and Avasarala's interests are starting to align. I find that very interesting, so I'll give this a +1. So next we get a scene of Captain Martin's going to Draper's room to dress her down for how she acted at the peace conference, and tries to convince her that she was just seeing things, and tells her that she's being sent back to Mars. Draper then asks if she can go to see the ocean, but Martin tells her she can't leave her room because she's a Martian and not used to being on Earth, so we see her trying to break out of her room. Now, in the novels, we do get a scene of Thorson yelling at Draper after her outburst at the peace conference, where she threw her pad across the room and asked, "What about the fucking monster?" Thorson tells her she's being shipped back to Mars, but Martins, who, as I mentioned before, in the novels actually cares about Draper and wants to help her, tried to console her in this situation, but Draper was never confined to her room like she is here, and she was always just free to leave whenever she liked. Again, I think both cases work well for their respective stories they set up, so I'll give this a 0. So next we go back to Ganymede, where Holden and Naomi are asking a medical care physician about Strickland or May, and when she doesn't know anything, they ask her about symptoms of the protomolecule infection, but she hasn't seen any of that either. So Holden points out to Naomi that this seems very different than Eros, and he starts to have his doubts about the protomolecule involvement. Amos and Prax ask around as well, and they similarly have no luck until Prax spots a man he knows as Baja, whose son is receiving the same medical treatment as May. So Prax approaches him, but Baja attacks Prax for leaving Ganymede, but Amos intercedes on his behalf, and Prax explains that they are looking for May, so Baja brings up a man named Roma, who is helping people find lost ones by looking through video footage, but he only does it in exchange for canned chicken. Amos thinks it's a scam, but Prax thinks it's worth a try. So this scene I find a bit ironic, because in the novels, Prax and Baja are in constant contact after the Ganymede incident, and it's Baja who gives up and plans to leave Ganymede, and Prax attacks him for it. And Baja nearly beats him to death in response. As in the novels, Baja is described as a very thick and imposing man compared to the thin and scrawny actor that they have playing him here in the show. Also in the novels, Baja has a family, a wife, and two other children, and other than his son Kotoa, who is the one that was missing, who we will see in the show in the next season. Now, as far as Roma goes, Prax was already in contact with him before he met Holden, and part of what inspired him to seek out Holden was that he ran out of chicken to pay him. So as far as Holden, as I mentioned, he wasn't aware of the protomolecule connection at this stage, so he wasn't looking for it. I definitely like Baja's portrayal in the novels better, as he was less of a stereotypical whiny character, and his interactions with Prax were actually interesting, so I'm going to give this a -2. So then we go back to Earth, where Ehrenreich goes into Avasarala's office and tells her about his suspicions that Bobby Draper wasn't telling the truth and that the Martians are testing a protomolecule weapon they purchased from Jules Pierre Mal. When Avasarala asks what his suspicion is based on, he admits to having had worked with Mal over the protomolecule project, but claims that he didn't know what would happen on Eros. Avasarala tells him that he needs to answer for his crimes because Eros nearly destroyed Earth, and he agrees that he will, but that right now it's more important to stop what the Martians are up to, so he gives her all the information he knows about the protomolecule project. Now, this is very different than what happened in the novel, says Ehrenreich wasn't involved with Mal during the Eros incident, which actually happened over a year ago in the timeline of the novels. And at this stage, Ehrenreich is still bidding for possession of the protomolecule hybrid, and Avasarala isn't at all aware of his involvement in this. But this works for the story the show set up, as it interestingly explores that Ehrenreich was only doing what he felt was right and is now willing to come clean in order to do what he thinks is best for Earth. A pretty interesting dynamic, so I'm going to give this a +2. So next we get a scene of Bobby Draper breaking out of her room by taking the window apart and then trying to climb down the roof of the building, which proves too difficult to her as she's not used to being on Earth, so she gets dizzy and falls, but she still manages to get away okay. Now in the novels, there was no need to run away or break out of her room. She wasn't confined to the Martian embassy. In fact, all she had to do was simply walk out, which why not? I thought the whole breaking out of the room was just a way to add dramatic tension, not really necessary, so I'm going to give this a -2. So next we go back to Ganymede, where Holden, Naomi, Amos, and Prax go find this Roma character and ask him to find the video footage of Prax's daughter. He demands chicken as payment. When Holden explains that they don't have any but can offer other things, he tells them no chicken, no service, so Amos then proceeds to beat him to a bloody pulp. Naomi tries to stop him, but Holden holds her back, but eventually Prax gets to him to stand down by insisting that they can't find May if he's dead. So Amos asks if he's going to help, and he says yes, absolutely he will. So in the novels, as I mentioned, Prax had already been to see him before he met up with Holden, so he knew that he wanted chicken. So Holden actually brought a lot of chicken with him. But when Roma saw how desperate they were, he refused to do it for the agreed upon price and tried to shake them down for more. So that's when Amos proceeded to beat the crap out of him. Now in the novels, Naomi wasn't present. She was back on the Somnambulist, but later would be critical of Holden for letting Amos beat the man up. I think it makes a little more sense in the book's version that he tried to shake them down for more, makes him come off as more despicable and worthy of the thrashing that he receives. So I'm going to give this a -1. So back on Earth, Bobby Draper comes across what looks like a homeless camp where she sees people living in squalor, and she asks the lady for directions to the ocean, but she demands 50 credits as payment to give away such information, which of course Bobby doesn't have. Now in the novels, Bobby doesn't go to a homeless camp. She goes to a coffee shop and has a cup of coffee and talks to the waitress there, who explains she's working so she can go to university, and explains how unemployment works on Earth because it's overpopulated. It's not portrayed as a poverty-stricken hellhole as it is here. I actually like the novel's version better, so I'm going to give this a -1. We then get a scene where Cotillard informs Avasarala that Bobby Draper has broken out of the Martian compound, which she finds really interesting, and she orders Cotillard to find her before the Martians do so that they can have a conversation. Cotillard then asks her what about Ehrenreich and why she hasn't turned him in. And she says that Ehrenreich is more useful to her still in play, but Cotillard warns that she's the only one that knows that he's guilty, so this could come and bite her in the ass, and as we know, it turns out that he's right. So in the novels, as I said, Draper never broke out of her compound. She simply walked out, and Avasarala just found her at a bar and had a drink with her. However, I do kind of like the dynamic better here. That's a race for her to find Draper before the Martians do, so I'm going to give this a +2. So we go back to Bobby Draper as she wanders through the homeless village, and she comes across a man who engages her in conversation and tells her he can tell her how to find the ocean. When Bobby says she has no money to give him, the man asks for her anti-nausea drugs instead. And when Draper accuses him of being a drug dealer, he explains that he can use the pills for medical reasons when they're forced to drink sewer water in the summer, and explains that he has some medical knowledge. When Draper asks him if he's a doctor, he explains that he signed up for medical school when he was 19 and that he's now 55 and he's still waiting for a response. So Bobby gives him the meds and he points her in the direction of the ocean. He then gives her some helpful tips on how to orientate herself with the horizon that she's not used to, and goes through an exercise to get her mind accustomed to it. So Bobby does the exercise, which does help, but when she looks up, the man is gone. Now, first off, the part about a man helping Bobby orientate herself to the horizon by doing an exercise was in the novel, but it wasn't some homeless guy that Bobby met. It was a guard at the UN building. And when Bobby first left the building, she got really sick and freaked out and banged on the door to get back in. Instead of mocking her, the guard was actually really nice to her and gave her some tips so that she wouldn't get sick. Which did help her. And as I mentioned before, Draper never went to a homeless village in the novels, but went to a coffee shop, and the conversation that she had there was similar to the one here, where it explains the nature of Earth's society that's based mainly on how overpopulated it is, and that there's not enough jobs or resources to go around. However, I feel personally that the picture the novel paints is more of a post-scarcity society where people don't work because they don't need to work, so they go on basic, where the government provides basic assistance, and those who do work choose to do so for extra luxuries and stuff, or to go into a career. Whereas it's portrayed here as more like a rich and poor dynamic, where those who don't work are screwed and live in squalor and poor living conditions, and the rich exploit them, which isn't quite the vibe that I got from the novels. As it was here. Future novels will portray similar situations, particularly in Baltimore, but I think the novel's version is more about a few rough areas that go badly with this setup, whereas where crime is rampant, whereas the show, I get the impression it's more of like the norm everywhere. I do have to say that I like the books versions better, as it seems less interesting in making commentary, or less interested in making commentary on modern society, and more interested in actually presenting a hypothetical scenario of what an overpopulated Earth that through technology doesn't require everyone to work would look like. And as much as I like the social commentary, I'm more interested in the hypothetical analysis, which I find more fascinating. So I'm going to give this a -3. So then we go back to Ganymede, where Holden and the others wait for Roma to find any clue to where Dr. Strickland took May. Holden assures Naomi that he would have stopped Amos before he beat Roma to death, but Naomi is still unhappy. Meanwhile, Prax talks to Amos, saying that he thought that he wasn't a psychopath, but Amos then talks about how, where he's from, scum like Roma use children for their own profit, and he has no tolerance for that. Prax then goes exploring the plant situation on Ganymede and tells Amos that the cascade is happening, where the station environment is dying, and because it's an artificial environment, he can't compensate the way a natural environment can. When Amos protests that Earth, Mars, and the Belt wouldn't let Ganymede die, as it's the primary food source for all the outer planets, Prax retorts that the station is already dead, they just don't know it yet. So first off with Holden Naomi, in the novels Naomi wasn't present at the beating, so she wasn't there to get pissed at Holden, but later she would chastise him for allowing Amos to beat Roma, claiming that that's not like him. And as far as the cascade goes, Prax did mention this in the novels as well. In fact, this was touched on a lot more through his musings and his own viewpoint chapters. However, I personally found it more relevant in the novels, as Ganymede providing food for the belt was more of a factor that was brought up more. Here in the show, it's barely touched on. In fact, they make a big deal out of Prax's conclusion here in this scene, but it will have absolutely zero impact on the rest of the story of the show. It almost seems like the show just included it to have an homage to the books, so I'm going to give this a -3. So then we get a scene of Alex alone on the Rosinante listening to country music while he floats around the ship and drinks beer. Until he gets a message from the MCRN warning that they're shutting down travel around Ganymede. Now, in the novels, we never saw Alex alone on the Rosinante because he wasn't a viewpoint character. However, Holden mused that Alex was probably in bed, wrapped in a space blanket next to a space heater. And frankly, I can see why this was left out of the books, because this scene was boring and unnecessary. Some may think that it's cool to see them play with zero-G, but I think it's a waste of a perfectly good effect shot. As for the MCRN warning, Alex tells Holden about this later on, so you don't really need to see that here, so you don't need this scene, so -3. So back on Ganymede, Roma finds footage that shows where Strickland took May, and apparently they went to an older, unused part of the station where there are no cameras, so he can't track them from there, but tells them if they want to find them, that's where they need to go. When Naomi asks what's down there, he simply says, "How would I know?" Now, this is similar to what happened in the novels, as Roma also discovered that Strickland took May to an older, unused part of the station where there should be nothing. But in the novels, Roma was acting a lot more injured and afraid of Amos and Holden, and when he mentioned that he couldn't track Strickland anymore, he flinched and expected to be beaten for it. But instead, Amos dumped a bunch of cans of chicken on the ground and said, "Keep the change, asshole." And Roma ignored them when they left, as he was just picking up his cans of chicken. And although it's not a big deal, I do think it makes more sense for Roma to be acting all cowardly like a beaten dog, so I'm going to give this a -1. So Draper finally makes it to the ocean and is in awe at the first time of seeing an ocean, even though it's very polluted and dirty and probably smells really awful. Avasarala and Cotillard catch up to her there, and Avasarala proceeds to tell her that she's correct about the monster and gives her information about the protomolecule hybrid. She then tells her that her own government is conducting these experiments and they used her and her team as lab rats. She gets pissed off, but Avasarala clarifies that she wished that it was the UN who did it because then she would have some control. She tells Draper that her superiors turned on her and she needs to help her stop them. Kotar then warns Avasarala that they need to leave before being spotted, so they leave, and it's unclear on whether or not Draper was convinced. So in the novels, Bobby Draper never went to the ocean. As I said, she just wanted to get a cup of coffee, and Avasarala caught up to her later that evening at a bar. So in the novels, Avasarala wasn't restricted access to her, and Draper didn't have to escape captivity. It was just a friendly conversation at a bar where Avasarala tries to convince Draper to come work for her. However, as I mentioned in the books, it was a different dynamic as Mars didn't have complete control over the hybrids yet. Because at this stage, Mars and the UN were both involved in the demonstration as they were both potential buyers. So Avasarala did have some control, but since it involved Mars and she could tell Draper wanted to do something about it, she asked for her help, so told her to report to her office for work the next morning. And similarly, when Avasarala left Draper, you couldn't tell if she was convinced or not. Now, as much as I think it's unnecessary to add the tension of Bobby escaping, I did like the fact that Avasarala had only a few minutes to talk to her, and overall the scene just seemed more urgent. Plus, having it by the ocean was a nice touch. I love the fact that she found a dirty, polluted ocean beautiful. It was really interesting. So I'm going to give this a +3. So my final adaptation score for Cascade is a -5. Now, I don't think this is a bad episode, but it's not a particularly good one either. It does have a lot of filler in it and does seem to stretch out the story a bit in order to fit this episode quota. But there are still some really interesting things in this episode, with Avasarala enticing Draper and Holden and Prax going to the Chicken Man. So all in all, not a bad episode, but not a great one. In many cases, the book just happens to do it a little better. So that's it for my book to show comparison for The Expanse Season 2, Episode 10. I'll be back here in about a month for my book to show comparison for Episode 11. In the meantime, you can check out my channel for many more videos on The Expanse, as well as other videos on other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.